This happened in 2017. I had been looking for a good spot to practice stealth camping, and I'd found what looked like a perfect place on satellite maps about 2 hours from my house. It was a large wooded area with a creek running through it, and from what I could tell online, it was private land. I knew this was technically trespassing, but I figured if I was careful and left no trace, nobody would ever know I was there. I parked my car at a pull-off near a bridge where the creek crossed under the road. From there I planned to hike upstream about a mile into the woods and find a good spot to set up camp for the night. I waited until after dark to start hiking, thinking it would be safer to move under the cover of darkness. The hike along the creek was easier than I expected. There was a faint deer trail that followed the water, and I used my flashlight sparingly to navigate the fallen trees and rocks. I was probably walking for about 40 minutes when I found what seemed like the perfect spot. A small clearing about 50 yards from the creek, surrounded by thick trees that would hide my tent. I set up my small 2-man tent and got my sleeping bag inside. I was pretty pleased with how well hidden the campsite was. You couldn't see from the creek, and the trees provided good cover from any direction. I heated up some food on my camp stove and ate inside the tent to keep the light contained. After dinner, I decided to explore the area a bit more. I wanted to see how far the creek went and maybe find something interesting to check out in the morning. That was my first mistake. I got careless with my flashlight, using it more than I should have as I walked around the woods. I was probably out exploring for around an hour when I heard the first voice. It was distant but clear. Someone was shouting. I couldn't make out the words at first, but the tone was definitely angry. I turned off my flashlight immediately and stood still listening. Then I heard another voice, closer this time. Someone was yelling about seeing lights in the woods. My heart started pounding as I realised they were talking about my flashlight. I'd been way too careless, and now somebody knew I was out here. I started moving back towards my campsite as quickly and quietly as I could. The voices were getting louder, and I could hear at least 2 different people. Maybe one more, I'm not sure. One of them was shouting about trespassers and telling whoever was out there to get off their land immediately. When I got back to my tent, I could hear footsteps crashing through the underbrush not too far away. They were still some distance away, but they were definitely heading in my direction. I knew I had to pack up and get out of there fast. I stuffed my sleeping bag into my pack and started taking down the tent as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking from adrenaline and I kept dropping things. The voices were getting closer and closer, and somebody was saying that they were going to call the sheriff. Just as I got the tent packed away, I heard the first gunshot. It was loud and echoed through the trees. I couldn't tell if they were shooting at me or just trying to scare me, but I didn't wait to find out. I shouldered my pack and started running through the woods as fast as I could. I was crashing through branches and stumbling over roots trying to get back to the creek. Behind me, I could hear the voices getting closer. Someone was yelling about having dogs and that they were going to track me down. Another shot rang out, closer this time. I reached the creek and started running downstream towards where I'd left my car. The water was shallow but rocky, and I kept slipping on the wet stones. I could hear people shouting behind me, but I couldn't tell how close they were. The sound of the water made it hard to judge distances. About halfway back to the road, I heard a third shot, but this one sounded different, more distant, like they were shooting into the air. Someone was yelling that they better not see me on their property again. I kept running along the creek until I could see the light from the road ahead. I climbed up the bank and ran across the field where my car was parked. I threw my pack into the back and drove away as fast as I could. I never went back to that area again. I learnt my lesson about being more careful with lights when stealth camping, and I definitely do more research now to make sure that I'm not camping somewhere that's actively monitored. The whole experience really shook me up, and I'm glad I got out there before things got worse. I was camping in a remote forest for the weekend. This was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It had an old deer trail leading to it, but it wasn't marked on maps or online or anything, so only hunters would probably know about it. I'm a wildlife nut, particularly wild birds. Really, this wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a few days in the woods to get a few good photos of local bird life for my collection. The first day was exactly what I wanted. I got there, set up camp, and took it easy for the whole day and night while I got some great shots of pine warbles and yellowthroats. My grandfather used to take me here when I was a teenager. In all my years going out to this spot, both as a kid with my grandfather and as an adult by myself, never once was anybody else here. It was that remote. Anyway, on my second day I spent my time exploring the forest, and I guess just enjoying the solitude and trying to get a shot of the white-throated sparrows I could hear. I must have walked those trails 5 or 6 times unsuccessful at getting that shot. Everything was calm and still, maybe a little too calm. But then on one of my trails through the woods, I happened to spot some clothes hanging from a tree branch in a small clearing. I'd been walking the same trail over and over and never saw them before. Where they were, it was so visible and obvious, I don't think I would have missed them. They also looked recently placed. And what was really strange was not only that the clothes were there and meant that somebody else was out here, but that they were children's clothes. A small shirt and shorts, like maybe for a 10-year-old. This was miles from any road or house, so it's not like some kid was just playing nearby, not to mention I would have seen them if they were around. Seeing this really creeped me out for some reason. Why I didn't see kids nearby while I was walking around, I didn't know. Were they watching me and didn't want me to see them? It was hard not to get paranoid about it. From what I was able to see, it looked like the clothes were hung deliberately on the branch. Then there were some small footprints in the soft earth leading away from the clearing, towards a thick grove of trees. I didn't want to follow them into the dark cluster of pines, so I just walked back to my campsite. I kept looking out towards the forest, or I guess the tree line around my campsite, seeing if anybody was out there. I never saw anybody. As the sun started to come down, the paranoia started to build up again. Something about the clothes just felt off, and knowing that somebody was likely still nearby, it wasn't a comforting feeling. When it got darker, I fueled up my campfire with a good supply of wood and sat around it. I did whatever I could to keep my mind off it, but it was pretty difficult. Part of me felt justified in feeling uneasy. Another part of me felt like I was overreacting for no reason. I've always been a logical person. But not too far into the night, I started hearing distant shouting and giggling coming from the trees. I can't tell you how spooky it was. I instantly turned and faced the darkness it was coming from. There was more than one. It sounded like children playing and laughing and whispering to each other near my campsite. I stared in their direction until suddenly something came into the light. It was 3 kids, maybe around 10 or 11 years old, just standing side by side. I couldn't see much of their faces or really anything more than basic shapes. I couldn't even tell if they were boys or girls. I asked what they were doing here. "Why are you kids in the forest?" I said. "Where are your parents?" As soon as I said that, 2 of them turned back and ran into the trees, completely disappearing. But one stayed where they were. They didn't move or even look back at the others. It was about then that I looked down and realised the kid was almost naked, wearing just shorts and a tattered vest. These were definitely the kids who'd left the clothing in the clearing. I asked again if they needed help, but then this kid just turned around and quietly walked back into the trees. I pretty much had an internal meltdown after that. That was the most unsettling and strange encounter I'd ever had, almost not even feeling real. I didn't want to be in those woods for a second more, so I immediately started to pack my things. I'm not the kind of person to stick around when things get weird. Thankfully, my shelter was easy to set up and take down, so I had everything down and in my bag and ready to go within a few minutes. I didn't know where those kids went, but I didn't want to still be here if they came back. I kicked out all the unlit logs from the fire so it would burn out soon after I left. I then hurried into the woods. The walk was nearly 2 hours. For the first 20 minutes I was really on edge, unsure if I was being followed. But the farther away I got, the better I felt. It was about 50 minutes into the walk. The whole woods were silent, not even any crickets or anything. There was no sign of any wildlife. Then suddenly I heard laughter and giggling nearby. It was in the distance, maybe 100 feet from me, and it was definitely children laughing and playing. I couldn't see anything though, so I had to just keep walking. Only a few minutes later I heard it again, this time on the other side of me. The giggling seemed muffled and echoing, which led me to believe that whoever it was, they were hiding behind the trees. It was probably the same 3 kids I'd seen at my campsite. If they'd been following me for this far into the woods, who knows what they were trying to do. For a while I'd keep hearing giggling in the distance, just short bursts like they were quietly watching me and suddenly moving to a different spot. I can't think of anything that would have been more terrifying than that walk through those woods. Somehow though, I made it back to my truck. I was able to get out of there. I wish I had more to say, or that I figured out who those kids were or what they were doing out there, but I have nothing. Maybe I'm crazy. Sometimes I wonder if they were even real or not. I don't know, and I'm not sure what to do. I kind of live locally to the area and I haven't heard anybody else experiencing anything similar. Thinking about that night just freaks me out, and I never went back, and I never want to. This happened in 2016. I had been planning a solo trip to explore an old hunting cabin that I'd found marked on some vintage forestry maps. It was supposed to be deep in the backcountry, about 6 miles from the nearest logging road. I should mention that the cabin was on private land, so technically I was trespassing, but I'd read online that nobody really monitored it anymore. I parked my car at the end of a dirt road where it was blocked off by a rusted gate. From there I shouldered my pack with enough supplies for 2 nights and started hiking along what used to be an old logging trail. The path was overgrown and barely visible in places, so I had to rely on my compass and the GPS coordinates that I'd found online to stay on track. The hike took me about 3 hours through increasingly thick forest. I was crossing fallen logs, pushing through brambles and navigating around swampy areas. I was really hoping that the cabin would still be standing and usable when I got there. If it had collapsed or was too damaged, then I'd have to find a decent spot to pitch my tent. When I finally reached the coordinates, I almost walked right past it. The cabin was tucked between some large pine trees and was so weathered it almost blended in with the forest. But when I got closer, I was relieved to see that it was still in decent shape. The roof looked solid and the walls were still intact, and the door was hanging a bit crooked, but it was still attached. I walked around the outside first, checking the foundation and looking for any obvious structural problems. The windows were mostly broken out, but the frames were still there. I tested the front steps, and the wood was a bit soft, but it held my weight. The door opened with a loud creak, so everything seemed okay. Inside it was bigger than I expected. There was a main room with an old stone fireplace and a small kitchen area, and what looked like a bedroom in the back. Everything was covered in dust and debris, but the bones of the place were solid. There was even an old wooden table and a couple of chairs that looked like they might still be usable. I swept out a corner near the fireplace and set up my sleeping area. I managed to get a small fire going using some dry wood I found stacked outside. As evening approached, I cooked dinner on my camp stove and sat by the fire feeling pretty satisfied with my find. After dark, I went outside to look at the stars. I was probably sitting on the front steps for about an hour just enjoying the silence and the crackling of the fire inside. And that's when I noticed a light moving through the trees in the distance. It was yellowish and seemed to be bobbing up and down like somebody was walking with a lantern. What struck me as odd though was that it was moving in a straight line, not following any trail or path that I could see. It was also moving pretty fast. Faster than somebody would normally walk through a dense forest at night. I watched it for several minutes as it got closer, then it stopped. I couldn't tell exactly how far away it was, but it seemed to be maybe 100 yards off. The light just stayed stationary for a while, then started moving again, this time in a different direction. Eventually it disappeared behind some trees. After a few minutes, I saw a figure emerge from the dark of the tree line. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 feet away from the cabin. The person just stood there motionless, and I could tell they were looking directly at me. My heart started racing and I felt a chill go down my spine. I called out hello, hoping to break the tension and figure out what was going on, but the person didn't respond at all. They just stood there for a few seconds, then turned around and walked back into the woods without saying a word. I figured it was probably another hiker or maybe somebody checking on the property. I stayed outside a little longer, but when nothing else happened, I went back inside and banked the fire. I woke up some time later that night to the sound of footsteps on the wooden steps outside. They were slow, like somebody was trying to be as quiet as possible. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. The footsteps moved across the front porch, back onto the grass, and then back onto the porch before stopping at the front door. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. Each time I heard a footstep, I pulled myself up from lying to sitting to crouching. Then I heard the door handle turn very slowly. The old door groaned as it swung open inch by inch. I could see a dark silhouette in the doorway against the slightly lighter sky outside. They stood there for a couple of seconds. I held my breath and tried not to move. Thankfully, I was concealed by pitch black. Then I heard them step inside, moving carefully to avoid making noises. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they moved into the room, and I could hear them breathing quietly. I was trying to figure out what to do when I heard them moving towards the back of the cabin, and that was my chance. I quietly grabbed my backpack and sleeping bag and crept towards the door. The person was in the bedroom area and I could hear them rustling around back there. I made it to the door and slipped outside. I didn't even put on my boots, I just grabbed them and ran into the woods with my socks. I could hear the person moving around inside the cabin, but I didn't look back. I just kept running until I was deep enough in the trees that I felt safe to stop and put my boots on. Using my flashlight sparingly and following my GPS, I managed to find my way back to the logging trail. It took me almost 3 hours to hike out in the dark, but I made it back to my truck just as the sun was coming up. I never found out who was in that cabin or what they were doing there. Maybe it was the landowner, maybe it was somebody else who knew about the place. Either way, I was glad I got out of there when I did.